Welcome to Urban Takeaways. This is a film series where researchers and practitioners meet from different disciplines and knowledge fields. We will focus on inspirational stories from sustainable urban development, on method development, and knowledge production across disciplines and sectors. My name is Nina Vogel and I will be your host. Today we will talk to Tim Hofmeester. He is an animal ecologist and an expert in citizen science. He works at the Department of Wildlife, Fish and Environmental Studies. And he's also the SLU Urban Futures Hub Coordinator in Umeå. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Nina.
Today we will talk about the theme of urbanization and its influence on wildlife, different life worlds and also ecosystems, though also vice versa, like how urbanites, people living in urban areas, may shift or change their perspectives on nature. So these could be themes of your research. So could we start by telling us a little bit more about your project, Meet Your Wild Neighbors? Who's involved and how did you collaborate?
Yes, of course. So Meet Your Wild Neighbors was a citizen science or community science project in Umeå that we ran last year. And who was involved? I mean, it was basically anybody in Umeå municipality that was interested in joining that could be involved. Meet Your Wild Neighbors existed of two different parts, where one part we had a camera trapping project and one part we had a bat project. So they were quite, those were slightly different and there were also different people participating in those two. But otherwise it was a collaboration with the municipality and also several researchers within SLU and outside of SLU.
Okay, and what would be your concrete research interest, or how did you use the data you collected?
So we wanted people to help us with mapping the occurrence of wildlife in the municipality. So with the cameras, that was mainly bigger birds and mammals that are walking on the ground and that we could see in people's gardens or in people's properties. Well, with the bat project, it was specifically about bat activity. And we wanted to have a better idea of where these species occurred because we basically know very little about how wild animals are using Swedish cities. So this was a first look into the secret lives of wild animals in Swedish cities and how they use the available green space.
Do you think that this will influence future development of cities?
Oh, good question. I mean, of course, I hope that the results that we find are informative for city planning, but it's hard to say. I mean, often when I talk with people from the municipality, they of course want to have very concrete answers, and it's really hard to give concrete answers based on the type of research that we have done so far. So, for example, what we see is that the amount of green space in an area definitely has an influence on the amount of wildlife that is in such an area. But then, for example, the city planners want to know, but how wide should a green corridor be? Should it be 5 meters or should it be 3 meters? And kind of those type of really specific questions are really hard to answer. But I think in general, the idea of collaborating with the municipality and then looking at how we can try to actually incorporate some of those questions in future study designs is a really interesting and exciting prospect.
And you talk about different actors involved and also different perspectives. So do you think that this form of doing research, like a citizen science, is actually fostering more transdisciplinary knowledge production and modes of working?
I think so. Specifically when we talk about, let's say, the science of citizen science, one of the things why I do these projects as citizen science projects and not just going around with some research students or research assistants going into the field is because I want to involve people in the scientific process and want to use these type of projects to give people experiences that they otherwise would not get. And then we, I think, get into this transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary field where it's both sociological factors that can play a role, as in kind of how do people relate to wildlife and nature in their surroundings, how can we potentially influence that or help creating experiences through scientific projects, how do people relate to science in general, but then at the same time learning people about or teaching people about ecology, about the wildlife that surrounds them, and of course then there's the kind of the interaction between ecology, sociology, and potentially also things like design and planning of how do we then kind of use this knowledge to plan cities or to better design neighborhoods where people can enjoy the wildlife around them, or actually try to design places where we are reducing the chance of certain species occurring there. So yeah, all of that I think is really both as a multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary perspective, but also really fits within some kind of future vision of coexistence or cohabitation between human and non-human actors, so wildlife, nature.
So quite complex to collect this different kind of data. And what you just mentioned sounds for me, there are many benefits with doing citizen science projects. And like being an expert in citizen science or having done different projects, could you like tell us a little bit more about also like maybe the challenges with doing such forms of science projects, and and also like the core like benefits at large?
Yeah, so in terms of benefits, I think specifically if we talk about environmental citizen science or the type of citizen science project that I just described, I think one of the biggest benefits is that we can give people these experiences where we see all over the world actually, we see that people are moving more and more, living more and more in cities. And as a result of that, they don't have as many experiences with nature and with as many links with their landscape around them anymore. In the city center of a large city, then there's not a lot of interactions you have with nature. And there's several studies now that have shown that this, what they call the extinction of experience, so basically the loss of experiences with nature, really has an influence on how people think about nature conservation, think about environmental issues. And one of the proposed, let's say, counter measures that we can take is actually do environmental citizen science with these people, where we give them the opportunity to actually explore, for example, a city park and see what type of insects and wildlife occur in the city park, and that there's actually a lot of nature around them, and that those different species have functional roles in an ecosystem that can either help with reducing mosquitoes, for example, or trees that provide clean air and oxygen. So there's a lot of these what we call ecosystem functions that we as people really need to survive, that are provided by nature, and kind of by giving people that experience and giving them that information that could potentially counter this extinction of experience. But then at the same time, I think actually reaching those people is one of the main challenges. One of the things we saw in our project, so apart from borrowing cameras and bed detectors to people to give them the opportunity to experience things that they otherwise might not have experienced, because it's relatively expensive equipment and therefore not everybody might have access to those. By making those freely available, we hope to give people opportunities that they would otherwise not have. But what we see in the surveys that we did with our participants is that, especially in the camera trapping project, it was all our participants on average had more interest and found wildlife more important, or had more interest in wildlife and found wildlife more important than an average group from the same municipality. So with the opportunistic, or basically how we recruited participants was opportunistically. So we had advertisements on social media and through regular media, and had a website where people could subscribe. We had a couple of activities in the city center and at the large fair. This was before Corona, where we advertised the project and tried to recruit participants. But because we did not actively go to certain neighborhoods trying to get people from those neighborhoods to also participate, we see that we kind of get a certain demographic in terms of people that are interested, already have an interest in nature, that subscribe to participate. So really reaching that potential group that could benefit most from the experiences, that might be, I mean, that's something that we likely did not really achieve within the project so far. And I think that's where one of those main challenges lies.
Would you say that the high media attention you actually received in this project and the different communication channels you chose to use maybe helps to reach these so-called difficult to be reached groups, which you often have in different research projects?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think potentially that could work, but just by talking with some people from several of the neighborhoods in Umeå that we did not necessarily reach people from, they often had an idea, or kind of came with the idea that we should maybe go to to neighborhood centers where people where there are several activities within the neighborhood to try to really connect to these people on a more personal level, and that might lead to a bigger participation in these neighborhoods. I mean, I guess this is outside of my field of expertise, as I'm trained as an ecologist, although I'm really interested in social science and the social aspects of connections with nature. But it would really be interesting to delve more deeply into these motivations of participation and how we can use that knowledge to reach those people that we think could benefit most. But then, of course, I think even the people that are already interested in nature, those could still be people that would not otherwise have had the opportunity to buy a camera trap or buy a bed detector, and therefore still got experiences that they otherwise would not have, which might have influenced their attitudes towards nature, for example. But to really dig into that, I think we would need a larger, more social science focused study connected to the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Could we come a little bit to a future outlook in your work? And would you say that citizen science has a potential or does actually influence more traditional science or how we understand traditional science?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a role for, let's say, or there's a reason why citizen science is becoming increasingly popular among scientists, and especially younger scientists. And I think this has to do with the whole debate in society about science and scientific integrity and the role that science has in society. And especially the idea that a lot of people have that scientists are sitting in their own ivory tower and not communicating with the world and doing their own stuff, but not really progressing society as much as they could potentially do. And I think citizen science and science communication, I think, are really interlinked in a sense, because you need you need communication if you want to do citizen science, because communication and feedback to participants is really key to getting a functioning project. So I think kind of the whole idea of opening up science to a broader range of participants, not only in terms of data collection, as we now mainly focused on in these projects, but also including people in the whole scientific process, from asking questions to designing studies to collecting the data, but then also analyzing the data and interpreting the data. I think there's a big role for or a big potential for using, well, let's say the knowledge of the crowd to really, at the same time, use the knowledge that is out there, but also open up science to be more of an open endeavor rather than something that is too difficult for most people to understand, or something that is so kind of only communicated within expert groups that nobody ever hears what's happening within certain scientific fields.
Yeah, so opening up and not only, if I understand you right, asking for collecting the data, but really to also frame research questions or problem standings and possibly also then solution ideas. So could you concretize a little bit of your future ideas? Yeah, for like maybe wildlife questions, but also in urban areas, but also for citizen science, maybe as more methodological approach. You started already.
Yeah, so I mean, one. That's a good question. I'm actually wondering. I've been thinking about this for a long time, but I'm kind of wondering if there's anything very concrete that has come out of that yet. I mean, one of the ideas that I think is really interesting is this idea of living labs, where and I can imagine actually that for a more, let's say, inclusive or broadly inclusive type of citizen science, there's really a need for a physical location where people can come together, hopefully after Corona, and really exchange ideas, because I think that's where let's say that's where the magic happens. As in, if I look at the meetings we had with volunteers, as soon as you start talking with people, then the questions appear, then the ideas of patterns that they have and hypotheses that they have appear. So really trying to make those interactions concrete, and I don't know, forming a toolbox of how we could kind of give a structure to these different aspects of the scientific process. I think that would be, for citizen science as a field, is one of the things where people are really now looking forward to, as in, if we really want to make citizen science as inclusive as we would want or as we would like, I guess more as a philosophical idea of opening up science to the world. There I really think we need structures in place that would help these different processes, and then the structure for data collection is there and has been tested and proved, but potential structures for all the other processes, I think, are things that where there's really a lot of potential for growth. And I think actually, in terms of the kind of going back to the urban wildlife and the Meet Your Wild Neighbors project, I think one of the things that we could start trying is to organize meetings or workshops in specific neighborhoods where we can kind of potentially reach both the people that we would otherwise not reach, and come up with a workshop structure where we could actually discuss these different issues, and we could do that at different parts in the project, where the first workshop could be about asking questions and kind of what type of patterns do we see, what are the types of questions that people have surrounding urban wildlife, and then we could do the study design based on those questions potentially, and then as soon as the data is collected, we could have another workshop of kind of looking at the data and discussing more what does this mean, or kind of how could we interpret these patterns that we see. And of course, I mean, there's a reason why there's a university education for becoming a scientist. So there, so kind of certain ways of thinking might be things that we kind of need to give. I don't know. There might be room for shape or giving people the right amount of information that they need to start thinking in a certain way if we need that. But maybe actually thinking in a different way about the same problem might get us much further. So I guess I'm complicating it for myself. I don't know if I have a straight answer on this part.
Would you say, Tim, that we can expect too much of our citizens, or do we actually build more inclusive and democratic science?
I don't think we can ask too much of. I mean, as long as everything is on a voluntary basis, then people should be able to give as much as they would like. So people that only want to participate in one part of the process and not in the whole process, they should have the opportunity to do that. And then I guess it becomes some kind of democratic or a way of democratizing science. But I think actually at the moment we might be asking too little of people, kind of, yeah, asking them to contribute with data, but not necessarily including them in the rest of the process. And there, of course, there are practical issues with opening up the other parts, and opening up the data collection is the easiest, and potentially also where scientists have, or at least from a first naive view where you would think scientists have most to gain. But I think actually that we have a lot to gain in all the other aspects as well. But we just don't see that yet, or most scientists don't see that yet. Another interesting aspect of future developments, I think, could be trying to run a more long-term program to really look at changes over time, both in terms of kind of how wildlife uses urban areas, but also being able to do a long-term program with the same participants to really see if we can incorporate them on a more long-term perspective. But that, I think, would really need the building of a relationship with these participants where their motivations are really important, but also the building of a trust relationship where we really kind of can develop what can participants gain from the project and what can we as researchers gain from the participants, and how can we do that in a good way.
Yeah, very interesting point. And that also makes me think of kind of forming a particular literacy of those different actors involved, in particular also those who normally maybe are not so engaged in science or knowledge production.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the big points in terms of citizen science for a lot of scientists is also to increase scientific literacy and with their participants to really learn or to teach about the scientific process and how science is performed. And I think this part might be specifically important for I know it's important for everyone, but it's specifically interesting, I think, for children, either children as participating as part of families, but actually part of the project with the cameras we did with a high school in Umeå, where the students were really part of the program, and we tried to incorporate some of the issues of doing ecological studies and doing science in their curriculum.
Thank you. Really, really curious to hear more about it, and really valuable insights. I mean, you really could span from opening up on large scale science and like processes to co-produce actually knowledge, to dealing with or working towards a toolbox in citizen science, as well as how to meet really people, maybe in different workshops. So thank you for all these ideas, and we hope to hear more from you, maybe broadcasting from a living lab in SLU, who knows. For now, big thanks, and talk to you soon again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
If you want to know more about this project, Meet Your Wild Neighbor, about SLU Urban Future, or about the next upcoming film, follow us on social media, visit our website, or sign up for our newsletter, Urban Updates. See you soon again.